recording? Yeah, okay, so WebEx should be broadcasting. That means you can watch from your computer if you want to. So quick notes, just a reminder on the schedule. Previously, Project 1 was due next class period. We postponed that by a class period, so now it is due on Tuesday the 12th. So basically a week from today. Hopefully that gives you some extra time, and you can use it wisely. As I proved by not being able to get done with mine today, sometimes stuff comes up, you need a little extra time. How's it going though?
It's going well. Getting there.
All right, awesome. I'm actually really excited seeing these on the Sync Sketch. I think, if I'm mistaken, let me know, but I think I was able to give feedback to everybody in this class, and I'm about halfway through everybody in the next class. I think even if I haven't gotten to yours yet, still go ahead and implement the other feedback that you've gotten from your peers. I think that's really, like, I'm already seeing better results even at that Sync Sketch submission than I expected, right? And I think that will give you some feedback early on to implement into it. So that's awesome. And so I'm really excited about seeing these. They Chungus. I love that it just lets you pick your name, and I'm like, all right, that's what it gets on the WebEx thing.
This is going to get college students pick their own names.
When Parker is in the class, he always requests access. Like, there's constantly these pop-ups that's like, Parker wants to notate your video, and I'm like, no, decline. And then it'll pop back up, and it'll be like, Greg's boss wants to notate your video. Yeah. Smooth, Parker. I don't know if he's watching this video. So anyway, so that's where we're at. We have a week from today. Project 1 is due. Does it feel like it's a good schedule, a good timeline to be able to hit it? All right. Well, I am going to go over most of the splining pass today. Basically, what I've gotten splined on mine is the main body mass. Okay, so where I'm at right now is I've splined the hips. I've done a cleanup pass on the feet, and I've splined up the spine. So let's talk about that first. First, let's talk about the word splining. What am I even talking about? Yeah, so just working in the graph editor, working with those spline curves. Maya calls it the graph editor. Max calls it the curve editor. I don't know what Blender calls it. Everybody has a different name for it. But those curves are all generated out of a spline algorithm, a B-spline algorithm. I'm guessing a B-spline algorithm. And so they're all manipulated in that curve. Those curves are all manipulated as a spline. We refer to that as splining. That means we took it out of stepped mode. We're starting to edit the curves as they actually transition. So I have a splining checklist here that I've put up on the network. It's in the resources folder. Actually, all these videos we've been watching are in the resources folder too. What? Really? Yeah, sure, Edge. Why not? That's the worst that could happen. So our splining checklist goes like this. Before I start this, when I say splining, we're going to grab every controller on your character, and I do mean every controller, and you're going to edit the spline curve for that controller. Like, where do you start is usually the hard part of that, right? And like, first, like, that sounds daunting. You're like, really? I'm going to edit the curve for my pinky finger? Yes, you are. I recognize that, like, that takes a long time for that to sink in, because most people still hear it as like, yeah, sure I am. I'll probably not have to do that. Until your pinky finger is making this popping thing, and you have to fix the spline on the pinky finger. So there's a systematic way you can go through what sometimes amounts to literally thousands of curves, right? You have to assess thousands of curves. Some of them, you open it up, you look at it, and you're like, no, I think that makes sense. Like, this is like, your foot is stuck to the ground through the entire animation. So when that curve is perfectly flat, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I don't have to do anything to that one, right? But most of them you have to, like, this is our check, this is where we check our work from our posing, right? Because we're trying to control so many different attributes while creating a pose that sometimes we change a rotation direction or something, right? Like your character's hips are rotating forward and then they rotate back and then they start rotating forward again. And you get these weird bobbles all over it. And that's why your animation feels like hitchy right now, why it feels like kind of poppy. And so this is the order in which we go through them. Now the thing you'll recognize on this is that we're going through them from the largest body masses down to the small ones, right, the smallest ones. We're also sort of going through the order in which that motion was originated, right? Like for me to take a step forward, like I can't take a step forward with just my feet, right, and leave my hips here. Like for that to happen, I have to move my entire center of gravity. I have to move my entire body to take that step forward. Which control does that? Right? Well, the closest we have to that is that center of gravity control around our root, right? Like usually it's sort of that circle around your hips. And so if I get that motion cleaned up, it's going to mess up some other stuff, but the origin of our motion is cleaner now, right? So we start with the root. We're going to edit all necessary root curves, all of your translates, all of your rotates. You probably don't have any squash or any scale controls on there unless that's some way that you're controlling the stretch of your spine. But we're going to go through our graph editor and fix all of those curves. Again, this is a hard part because you have to kind of disregard all of that other stuff that's moving, right? You kind of have to focus on your character's hips and say, are those moving in the right arc, right? Think of them as a bouncing ball or an individual object. Are those moving correctly? Some rigs will allow you to actually hide parts of your character so you can focus on those elements. Mine doesn't. So I have to kind of like abstract that. I have to kind of look at that section of the character and think of it as a single object moving. So we're going to edit all necessary curves. We're going to check the relationship between the feet and the root and offset if necessary, right? So what I'm trying to say there is like your character takes a step forward, right? And your key pose is like, it starts with a character here. Your next key pose is your character is stepping forward, right? Well, before you get your hips out there over that leg, you probably want to get that leg out there first to catch yourself. So it's going to arrive at that key pose maybe a frame or two early, right? So we can offset when the feet get to areas. Also, if your foot is pushing your hips forward, then that foot is going to actually stay back there just a little longer. And as it is right now, where you set those key poses all together, they're just going to happen at the same frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit those root curves, and then I'm going to make sure that the feet actually look like they're causing the center of your mass to move around. And then any feet curves that I have, I will edit those as necessary. After I get my root motion looking really good, I work up the spine. So I start at the lowest FK controller, and I edit all of the curves on that, working up the spine control. So usually a spine has somewhere between 3 to 5 FK controls. If you have IK controls, you still kind of work up the spine because that motion from your root is going to affect your spine directly, right? And your question is your spine leading that motion or is your spine following behind, right? And so we're going to edit those curves all the way up the spine. At the end of your spine is what? Your neck and head, right? And that's this very like noticeable overlapping action that happens in your body. Your head has a little bit more motion than your spine. So I work all the way up the spine and then I edit the head. So edit all necessary curves on the head and neck controls if it's a separate control. From there, I'm going to work out down the arms. So you start with the clavicles, go to your shoulder, elbow, arms, right? So I just go down the arms to at least to the wrist control. right? And then any hand controls, I'll do a little bit of work on that, but hopefully that will be some stuff that I do like in the polish pass. And after I work down the arms, I've kind of done all of the biggest part of the splining pass, right? Now, where I'm actually at right now is right before I would work down the arms. You know, that's where my piece is that I'm going to show you today, and the process that I'm going to show you today. So you're going to edit all FK arm controls. If it's an IK, you would do it a little differently, but still, like what your torso is doing is going to directly affect what your IK hands are doing. Okay, so the next steps are offsetting and polishing. Okay, so offsetting means that we may be editing these curves, we may even be doing a little bit of offsetting on there, but usually everything is still happening together, right? Like if your character is surprised and it goes from one pose into another pose, more than likely it feels like everything kind of hits at the same time. Even if you got some like overlapping action built into that curve, we can offset some stuff to make it happen differently. Like we can just start shifting curves on different controllers, shifting sections of curves to make that feel way more loose, like everything's kind of hitting at a different time. Usually after I do that, it kind of messes up my curves just a little bit again, and I have to tweak a few things. So we're going to offset any rotate or translate keys that happen to happen one frame before the rotation, right? So if my character is stepping one step to the side, I may have that translation key happen one frame before all of the rotation keys happen. So I just go to my graph editor, grab those, and shift them. I'm going to offset the spine and head controls to show lead and follow. So if the character is like very dragging their head along behind them, then the head keyframes will happen maybe a frame or two after the spine keyframes. And maybe the upper part of the spine will happen a frame or two later than the root control, right? You kind of have to shift these around and see if it gets better or see if it gets worse. Then I'm going to offset down the arms. So like if your character is really loose on the arms, the shoulder is going to move first, the elbow will move second, the wrist will move third, right? To add any lead and follow. But if the character is kind of eager, maybe the hand moves first and the elbow moves second and the shoulder moves third. And then the last thing in the offsetting is I'm going to offset each arm to reduce any twinning and add any overlapping action. Okay? So for example, if my character is doing this gesture, everything hits at the same time. If I just have one arm hitting a little later, it'll feel like this. It'll feel a little looser, right? So that's the offsetting stage. Polish is where I dream someday you will get to, right? Like really, like if you get to all of this down to offsetting, most people don't even get to the offsetting part, like they haven't even touched all the curves. That's why it takes a lot of time. What really gets you hired, what really gets you a job, is this polish pass, right? You're adding detail, assuming all of that other stuff is good. So the polish pass, you're adding any detail motion to the head where needed. So that's little things like when you're talking, sometimes you accent just a little bit with your head, like you do little things like this. Your head kind of has a little bit of a more twitchy motion to it and has little nuanced motions to it. So I'll add that in. You'll add any detailed animation to the hands where needed. I think that I talk about this a little bit later, but like if I need very specific hand poses, right now they may feel like stiff with the keyframes I have. I have to add additional breakdown poses just in the hands to get that motion feeling more fluid, right? I'm going to offset the fingers for lead and follow. If you think about how your hand opens, you usually start with your index finger and end with your pinky, so you unroll them like that. And then you close your hand, you usually start with your pinky and end with your index finger. It kind of rolls in. But when you set your key pose, your character is going to be doing this, right? And that feels very robotic. Even more than that, if you watch how your fingers unroll, your index finger, like the biggest knuckle rotates first, and then those second two rotate a little bit later. When you close them, it kind of does the other way. Those second two rotate first, and that biggest knuckle rotates later, right? So adding some offset on that, that's that level of polish that's going to loosen the hands up and make that feel a little bit more organic. I'm going to double check my curves one more time to fix any noticeable pops or inconsistencies in the spacing, timing. So what may be happening is like your character's arm is moving, and if you're kind of looking at the spacing of where the finger is on each frame, there may be a section in the middle where that spacing increases drastically and then slows back down. And that's just little nuances of the curves. Sometimes you have to just keep that motion, like that spacing, feeling consistent. And the curves, like, is a place you can fix that. Sometimes there's a little bitty hitch in the curve that causes that arm motion to feel like it has a little pop in the middle of it. And it's not really that you can always even see it. It's kind of like you feel like something hitched there, and you have to go through your curves one more time. I usually run an arc tracker, so the editable motion trail works for that. But I run it on the head, the nose, the arms, the legs, and anything that is sort of waving around, right? If there's a dull arc in the tip of your finger, you can push that and it'll push the appeal of that motion. Your head moves a lot, and if there's weird hitches all over it, then that feels weird too. So I usually will track the tip of the nose and kind of think about how my head's moving with the tip of the nose in mind. I also kind of like to think of the top of the head as well, like how that's moving, has its own specific arc as well. And then we're going to add any detailed contact information. So for example, if my character's hands are apart, I put them together, right? That does not really feel like they're touching each other, right? It doesn't feel like they're touching each other until those fingers start to bend as a reaction to it, right? So that's the little tiny things, like if your character touches like themselves on the chest, your hand may be stopping suddenly, but you need to add that contact with the fingers, anything like that you may be having. I add any detail, let's say, yeah, I already got that part. And then the last few things I add are eye darts or any other miscellaneous small details. If your character has lip sync, I usually do the lip sync like sort of right after the arms pass, maybe after the offsetting pass, because then I know exactly where the head's going to be. There's a little bit more polish involved on a lip sync piece. But eye darts, if your character has eyes, your eyes are kind of the next step down past your head, right? You started with the root motion of your hips, you worked up your spine, you did the head curves, right? Well, the next thing in that chain is your eyes. Because if you think about lead and follow, that's how that works. Like if I'm talking to somebody on this side, and I'm really not interested in the person who's tapping me on the shoulder, my eyes are the last thing that turns and looks at me, right? But the opposite of that, if I hear something off to the side that really interests me, my eyes are going to turn first and lead my head. The other thing is your eyes are never still. If you look at tracks, like where people can track your eye movement, your eyes move like a lot. Like they're constantly darting back and forth between different things. And they never drift from one thing to the other. They always dart. An eye dart happens in about 2 frames. So if I'm looking at Amy and then I glance over at Dylan, they go from looking at Amy to Dylan in 2 frames, right? It's a really fast dart. And then maybe I go from Dylan to the back of the room in 2 more frames, right? And so your eyes are constantly like this, like constantly moving around. Next time you're having a conversation face to face with somebody, watch how their eyes move. Like it's like they're constantly like little twitches, right? And that's because they're bouncing between your mouth to your eyes, to your nose, to your forehead, to your eye, to that zit, to your mouth, to your nose, right? Like they're just looking all over your face and it's constantly moving around. So when your eyes are dead, like that's really a very computer-generated feel to it. Okay, so we sat here and stared at a list for a long time while I read it to you. That was not that exciting. Let's look at some of the process of this. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this in just a. Am I going to do this first? I'm going to come back to this in just a second because there's really just a couple of little tools I wanted to show you in Maya with the graph editor that probably works best just by me showing them to you. But what I'd like to look at is this 3 splining. This first thing is, you'll remember when I was looking, when we looked at where we left off before. This will open now. This is what it looked like in stepped mode, right? Again, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm like, oh, that worked out pretty well, right? It's when we switch it to splined mode, when I select all of my keyframes and take it to splined, that's when it starts looking like this. And I just feel like an utter failure. Right? I'm like, all of that work and it still looks this bad. Now, the first thing I want to show you is a sort of a trick in Maya. This one is not time-lapse because it's not super, it happens pretty quickly. To fix most of those little hitches that happen, I just need to fix the Euler Euler interpolation, right? So, what I'm talking about here is the way that these curves change from, or how these curves mix together in order to get this rotation. So I just selected all of them, set it to auto tangent, and you can see right there, that's where she messes up, right? She's turning this flip forward, and it messes up right there. You can see that spike in my X rotate. You see the spike? That's where she's rotating forward. It continues to climb. Actually, select rotate X here in a second. It's continuing to go upward, and then suddenly it shoots way down to the ground, right? And so the way I fix that is I just go to curves and I choose Euler filter. So let me go back so you can actually see that. I do it several other times here, but curves, and it's right above that. Go ahead. Right there. So it's pronounced Euler, or that's what people keep telling me. It looks like Euler, E-U-L-E-R. So, Euler. So what does that mean? Like, what am I doing there? Like, because as soon as I run this, it actually fixes the rotation on our flip. You'll see it happen. So, anybody have any idea what's happening here?
So, like, I think what happens is when Maya interpolates, like, you flipping 100 and 360 degrees as it needs to be at the same exact point. But when you run it through the Euler filter, it will try to articulate continue to stretch the curve. Yeah. It'll allow for it to be in the same relative position, but a different position than the graphical.
Exactly. Like if you think of how I'm standing right now, this would look exactly the same if I turned 3 front flips and then was standing here looking at you again, right? Maya can't tell the difference between 0 degrees of rotation and 360 degrees of rotation when you're trying to pose that. And so what it's doing is it's taking it to about 180 degrees, and then instead of continuing on around to 360, it just goes back to 0 again, right? And when we run this Euler filter or Euler filter, it's kind of like, stop being stupid, Maya, pay attention, right? And this is really like, this is going to cause all sorts of rotation issues for you. Because there is an infinite number of ways that I can get into any pose, right? Like, think about this. If I were going to go from facing you to my back to you, right? From this to all the way turned around with my back to you, right? Now, me and you just logically know that the easiest way for me to do that is to rotate 180 degrees in my y-axis, my up and down axis, right? If I just rotate 180 degrees, I get to there. That is the simplest way to interpolate between those two poses. But it's not the only way. I could also lay down on the ground on my back, roll over onto my stomach, and then stand back up, right? That is also a possible solution to get into that pose. It's just not logical, right? And what the Euler filter is doing is it's looking at all of the context of the rest of the curve and saying, you know what, we probably didn't make the right choice there. Let's recreate these curves in a more logical choice. So when I do that, watch what happens to my X curve. Instead of going back to 0, now it continues to climb up to 360. And now she rotates correctly if we scrub through there, right? Now her head and her arms are still messing up, but her root is doing the correct thing. The reason her head and arms are messing up is because they're wrong too. So I just have to grab them and run this Euler filter on them as well. So Euler rotation, so Euler filter, and her feet are flipping backwards too, so I just grab both of those and I run it one more time, Euler filter. And now if you scrub through it, like it doesn't look nearly as bad, right? Now it's still floaty. It's still got some it's not as poppy as it needs to be, but it looks a lot better now in Maya. So I thought you'd be interested in seeing what that actually looks like as a play blast. So this is the comparison. This is what it looks like in spline mode. This is where I'm really starting, right? Now I will acknowledge this still to me doesn't look as good as my stepped mode did. And the reason for that is that stepped mode has pop to it, right? It was very snappy and had energy and these fast transitions. And Maya just kind of softened all of that, right? And so that's what I'm doing in my spline pass, is I'm trying to get some of that texture and energy back into it, right? So that's what I do in these next few videos. So what you'll see that I've done is I've splined my hips, I work on my feet, and then I spline my head, or spine in my head, and then I just show you roughly where I'm at now. Because really what I have left to do is the arms, the overlapping action, and the polish pass. So, so let's go ahead and watch some of these here. So I'm going to show you a little bit more in the graph editor here in a minute. I usually set it up like this when I'm working for these videos just so you can see it all on one screen. You're probably going to be working on multiple screens, and however you want to set that up, that's your call, right? So you'll see that this is my my translate X, right? And so the translate X is on her root control is her side-to-side motion, right? So every step she takes, she is shifting from side to side a little bit. Wow, I maybe should have time-lapsed this one a little slower. So what I'm doing is I get my camera here in perspective in an axis where I can see the result of those changes I'm making, right? And as I make those changes, I just sort of scrub through to see if that's flowing better. As I fix things on this root control, I'm going to mess up things with the legs. I'm going to start getting IK pop where the legs are stretching too far. I'm going to start messing up other translates and rotates. I don't care. I want to get the hips looking right. I will deal with, future Greg can worry about those, right? He's probably more competent than current Greg because he has more experience. So, and I think that's a good way of looking at it, right? So the next curve is my Y. That's the up and down, right? So you have to recognize that every time the character takes a step, there's that weight that hits the ground, right? And so I'm trying to make those impacts of her running in a little bit sharper, a little bit harder there. And then as she goes up the tree, this got complicated because she jumps upward, but she makes contact with that tree. She impacts the tree, and then she has to sink into that impact as she's still moving upward, right? So this is really complicated. This is why I have to do this one curve at a time. Little things you're seeing I'm doing right here, I'll show you this in a minute. I'm adding new key poses, or new keys on this curve with the add key tool. So you'll kind of notice me do it right here. I want some more overshoot on this landing. Did I go far enough? Yeah. So I want some more overshoot. I'm sort of dragging that back to get a better arc on the motion there. And then when she hits the ground, I want it to sink in and sort of have this sort of settle bobble to it. And that's why we kind of get that little wave that happens at the end. So again, every curve. Now I'm on my translate Y. I'm like, what's my translate Y? Well, that's her forward and backward motion. And I may have to bounce back and forth, as you see here. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between my translate Y and my translate Z, because those are very closely connected the way she goes up the tree, right? Suddenly she's running at a diagonal angle, right, up that tree. So the way her forward motion works and her up and down motion works is very connected. I just play blasted it to see if what I made changes in the graph editor made sense to me. Felt a little off, so I tried to clean that up a little bit more. So you're seeing me, like these are really small changes, but they will change the way that energy feels. Right? Okay, now I'm on to my rotates. My rotates are a little different, right? Her rotate X is her forward and backward rotation on that root motion, right? So there's some big changes to that in the flip. Some of this I'm just trying to make it a little smoother in the way she rotates through it. What you're seeing here, I'm adding a little bit of that like settle, like that overshoot and overlapping action. And we'll talk about that in the graph editor here in just a minute. And now I'm on to rotate Y. Rotate Y was a little less noticeable. It's just that twist around. So she doesn't do a lot of twisting that root motion this way. But she does a little bit. She does that one big twist. So I kind of worked with that and the translate Z. What am I doing with translate Z here? Oh, translate Z, I realized from that I needed her to kind of pop backwards just a little bit more. So again, I'm kind of bouncing around between some different curves a little bit. If I see something while I'm in one curve, I can always go to the other. But I try to focus one curve at a time and get it cleaned all the way through, just so I can look at it and see if that's correct. I will tell you, this is not the only way of working. Again, like most of what I'm doing right now, I'll go ahead and let it play through. What some people, or I'll go ahead and pause it for a second. What some people do is they, like to me, this is 100 frames. That's manageable. I can assess 100 frames worth of motion. Some people like to assess shorter chunks, right? So what they'll do is they'll shorten their timeline and only do like the first 30 frames of the animation. And they'll do all of the curves on the root for that first 30 frames and then work up the spine, down the arms. They'll do everything on that first 30 frames. And that's because you can focus on pretty much one action at a time, right? If the only thing you're trying to perfect is that jump up the tree, then you can stay focused on it, right? That is a very good way of working. If I'm really struggling with a shot, or a shot has a lot of really interesting textural elements to it, I will work that way. And there were stretches of time where I worked that way exclusively. Most of the shots I work on are a little shorter, like they're probably usually under 300 frames. So I have a tendency to work on the whole thing. That doesn't mean that that's the right way for you. So if you decide you want to work on a section at a time, like that is a very good way of working. So again, I'm just continuing to polish all these curves, go back and forth. And this whole video, I don't know, this is probably about 20 minutes worth of work, 30 minutes worth of work, I would say, of just working on that root motions curves, right? That's important because everything else is hooked to that. So I gotta make sure that that's working correctly. So I play blast often, or I play blast at least every couple minutes, because what I'm seeing in my viewport isn't always playing back every frame because it's Maya, and like Maya hogs down a lot of resources. Maya 2019 apparently now has this animation caching thing, which will kind of like play blast in your viewport in real time. So supposedly your playback in there looks really good. We don't have 2019 on here yet. Hopefully we will next semester. But that may keep you from having to play blast as often. But you don't want to, you're not getting all of the information just when you hit play in your viewport. You're getting most of it, but not all of it. So play blasting periodically will give you some stuff to focus on. So that's where I was at. Now, from there, I spent some time working on the feet. If my hips are correct, more than likely, my feet are now messed up, right? So when the feet are pushing off, like I stretch the legs too far because I changed some stuff on the hips. I have some stuff where I'm not getting a clear contact on the heel. And so what a lot of this you're seeing me do is a mix of working in the graph editor and actually adding some additional keys and shifting keyframes on my timeline. So feet are really interesting. If you think of the way that they work, every time your foot comes off the ground, you have all of the same key poses for your foot as you do a character jumping, right? You have your neutral where your foot's on the ground. You have your contact where your foot pushes off the ground, like rolls up on the toe to push off the ground. You have your up where your foot is up in the air. You have your contact where your foot touches the ground again, and then you have your neutral where your foot is flat. So it takes 5 poses to pick up your foot and set it back down again, right? And so like I'm really kind of taking all of that into consideration of where the feet are. Little things right there is like I felt like her rotation of her foot was too sharp and hard, so I softened that a little bit. And so all I'm doing is now that the hips are correct, or I think that they're pretty close to correct, I'm focusing on the feet and trying to make them correct. Now these feet, because she does this giant flip, also probably need a couple of extra keyframes for the arc. I want you to notice right there where I was at, like up until just now when I offset those keys, I don't know when I was actually making these poses, looks like right through here. Right? So all of these poses with the feet, notice how many keyframes are on my timeline right there. Right? I get to a point where I think I have, yeah, right there. I have a key every frame for about 7 frames, right? And like I could do that in the graph editor, but I decided, no, I'm an animator. I'm going to put the feet in the exact right location for every frame of this flip, right? And that was just easier for me to do that than to fight with the graph editor to do it. And so you'll see sections in there where I literally have a keyframe on every frame for a stretch of time. It doesn't mean that that's always the most efficient way, but in this case, I was trying to get a very specific arc and IK out of the feet. That's how it worked best for me. Right? Some of the other things you'll see happening here is I start to offset stuff. So like as she pushes off that tree, I keep her right foot on the tree 1 frame longer, so it feels like she's sort of pushing off asymmetrically. And then right here, as her feet come down, I have her, that foot land a frame later. Right, so her right foot hits first, and her left foot hits 1 frame after. And just that little bit of offset, like you'll never see it, but it will make it feel a little more loose. Right? I'm also offsetting the feet on that little jump back, so it feels like her right foot goes first and her left foot comes later. And these little bitty things really will help on the looseness of this. It'll make it feel less like a computer made this, right? And a lot of times that's really the biggest thing we're fighting, is fighting the look that a computer made this. All right. Spine and the head. This video is less interesting. And this video is less interesting to make too. Basically what I did is I went through every one of those controls and sort of asked myself, based off of what the hips are doing or what the root is doing, is my spine reacting accordingly, right? And she has a very simplified spine rig. She has 2 IK controls on the top and the bottom, so I can sort of translate those wherever I want them. And then she has 1 rotation controller right in the center to get this curve in her spine. So most of what I was focusing on was that middle rotate controller, right, to get that working correctly. So a lot of what you're seeing there is me asking, does that rotation make sense compared to what our hips are doing? As I went up the spine a little more, I get to her head here in a second, and the head motion has a little bit more going on. Like she has like a lot more of this, it's a big, heavy looking head, like she's got this enormous skull. And so this motion is going to have a lot of overlapping action on it. So some of it is I'm trying to, there we go, I'm on the head now. Some of it is I'm trying to make sure that these motions look correct for it, right? I have this weird spot right there where I feel like her head and neck is kind of too weird of an angle there. I fight with that in the graph editor for a little while and decide, you know what? All of this is still on the same keyframes. I'm just going to go in there and repose part of the head. So I fixed that. For this part right here, again, like she hits the ground, her arms overshoot. I add some overshoot in her head and have it sort of come back as well. So here's where I'm just going to start keying it. There we go. There we go. I was happier with that. So again, I'm just trying to figure out what the head should be doing in reaction to the rest of the spine. You'll see here that I kind of did a little bit of an extra bobble on her head after she hits. That wasn't there in the posing. I just sort of added that as a little overlapping action in the final thing. There we go. All right. Now, I have this video here, which is just where I am now. I still see lots of little things I'm going to have to work on. Frankly, I was trying to get this done as quickly as possible, and I still think that there's a couple of little things with the weight on the run-in and probably the push-off of the tree that to me feel a little off. Like it feels like it still needs to be a little punchier. It may be a timing thing. Remember that the retiming tool is there, and I'll show you that here in just a second on how to use that. But the retiming tool I may be able to stretch some stuff, scrunch some stuff together and get this a little punchier in spots. Once I do that, it'll probably mess up some of my curves and I'll have to do another pass through them. That's okay, like it's worth it. But this is what I have so far. I wanted to show you this because this doesn't feel finished either, right? She actually has a spot where her arms like go through her skull, like literally into her head. And so there's little things with her arms I really still have to fix. But the reason I watched this is because I'm comparing it. Oh, actually, no. Let's go ahead and compare it to the one that makes sense. I'm comparing it to this, right? So this is where I started, and that looks okay. But again, like, this is where I am now. This is probably 2 hours more of work. And it's not a huge change, right? So remember when I was talking about like keeping yourself motivated, this is where that gets hard, right? Because you'll be working in your graph editor for an hour and a half and you'll be like, I don't know if that got better or not. Did that get better? Like save play blasts and you can go back and watch them and be like, oh no, that's better. Like this is punchier now on that landing and how she does the jump back. I feel like there's still a little bit of work on how she enters the scene, but this is better now. Like I can see the parts that are better. It's not perfect, it's not finished, but that is the hard part about the splining process and the polish process, is that the improvements you make are really small, right? So what they call it the 80-20 rule. Like you get 80% of the way there with 20% of the work. So you get that last 20% of finished with another 80% of the work, right? The splining process is that other 80% of the work. And I honestly don't think that's the right percentage. The splining process is really about another third to 2/3 of the process, right? But usually I probably spend, I don't know, I probably spend about 50% on posing and breakdowns, 50% on splining. The splining is way less gratifying to watch, like especially while you're working on it, right? So find something else that keeps you interested. And it may be play blasting it periodically to keep you into it. This is a little bit of a brain hack for me. I would, well, a couple of things. I would set small goals for myself and then reward myself. I would say, I'm going to spline all the way to the top of her head, and after that, I'm going to see what trailers were released last night for new movies coming out, right? And I'll take 15 minutes, I'll just watch some trailers. It'll be fun, right? Another thing I do as a little brain hack is I make myself, like, I don't know if you can work while listening to podcasts or audiobooks or anything like that. I knew that when I was getting to the splining process, I would like not be as excited about it. And so I would find an audiobook that I loved, right? And I would make sure that I was really, like, find one I'm really excited about. Like, don't listen to some garbage you don't care about. Find some book you're just like geeking out about, right? And be like, well, you can listen to that book if you're splining. But if you're not splining, you can't listen to that book. And so, like, I would make myself spline just because I wanted to hear the rest of that story. I wanted to find out what happened at the end of Ready Player One, right? I know, and that's a great audiobook. It's read by Will Wheaton, if you're interested. So I know that, that's cool. I recognize that this sounds like discouraging a little bit. I'm like, oh yeah, this part's miserable. You're gonna hate it, right? But I think it's important for me to be honest with you. Like this is not for most people their favorite part of the process. But this is also not extremely intensive in terms of the creative part of the process. Meaning this is where your brain can kind of go on autopilot. After you get good at this, then you don't have to make a ton of creative choices. And that means this is kind of where the creative part of your brain gets to take a break, and the autopilot part, the part that's good at repeating processes, can just work and get it done, right? Because if you had to be like, I'm making creative choices 8 hours a day for the next 40 years, like you would burn out really quick. It's like you need to have that balance in there. So this is almost like a break to me now. I'm like, cool. I'm into splining. Now I'm going to put on some audiobooks. I'm just going to spline today. It's going to be a fun day of splining because I'll finally figure out how Ready Player One ends. I've owned the movie since the day it came out, and I still haven't watched it. But the book is incredible. Anyway, I don't know if the movie's as good. Is the movie good?
Yeah, it is. It's really awesome.
I like it.
All right, cool. I don't know. I'm excited. Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, some people are like, it's good, but it's not as good as the book, and I'm like, you can say that about anything. Every movie made. So the last little thing I want to show you is just a couple of little things in the graph editor. Okay. So you already kind of know this, I think, but I'll show you again anyway. I just put a couple of frames in here. The biggest one is my translate Y. And so right now my motion on this ball, let me get you a little bit, where you can see this a little bit better, is it does that, right? Now, I think you already know this, but any of these curves in your timeline, you can shift those around from side to side. Of course, you can shift them around up and down too, and that's going to really mess stuff up for this curve, right? If you just need to shift them in the timeline, you can shift them here, or you can select them here and hold down Shift middle click while you're moving them, and just slide them from side to side. So you can kind of quickly retime this. If I want that motion to happen faster, I can just push these closer together, right? The other way we can retime, though, is called the retiming tool. So if you have a ton of keyframes on here, this becomes way easier to handle. The retiming tool is this thing right here, these little 3 lines right here in the top corner. So if I click that, I just double click somewhere in my timeline at the beginning, and it gives me this yellow bar. Okay, yes?
Similar kind of question, where's the option to snap on the timeline again?
That's if you have to highlight stuff and then right click and go to snap. I'll actually show you that here in a minute, because this retiming tool is totally going to mess some stuff up. So you can, but once you use some tools, it still takes it to not whole keyframes. So like for example, right now, if I just click in this middle spot here, I can slide my entire animation around, right? And I can slide it like less than a whole keyframe if I wanted to. Now, if I double click again, I get another one, and if I click on this one, I can kind of scale the whole animation. The more of these I add, the more control points it gives me for all of my curves. So let's say I wanted most of this motion to be earlier. I can sort of scale it this way, or I can delete this keyframe. I can put one here, and I can stretch that out. Right? So all of this is like ways that you can retime all of these curves. You'll want to have everything selected when you're doing this, because you don't want to just end up retiming the head instead of like the entire body. But this is a really nice tool in order to make your motion just a little bit punchier. Maybe you want to exaggerate it a little bit from your reference. I would do this before you go into the splining pass, right? Having said that, you may spline it and then look at it and still be like mine currently, I'm still like, I think I can do one more timing pass on this and make it better. So that means I can still do that even though I've edited all those curves. I'll probably still want to go back through those curves and give them a cursory glance to make sure I didn't break anything too bad. But this is a way of doing that. Again, once I've done this, my keys are now on, like, not whole keyframes. So if I go back to W, now I'm just in the move tool, right? But if I select this keyframe here, the value you'll see is 6.997, but the keyframe has a little star on it, right? This one's a better example. This keyframe is on keyframe 9.39, which means it's basically on frame 9.5. And since we're only rendering whole frames, that doesn't do us any good, right? If I go there and tried to hit S again to copy over that keyframe, I just get a second keyframe that is also on 9, right? Which doesn't help me. It actually just makes it confusing. So again, to snap all of this, I just hold Shift, double click on my timeline to highlight everything, right click, snap. So you'll need to remember to do that anytime you scale any curves, just because Maya is going to scale it to be mathematically perfect, not to snap to whole keyframes. And so you have to just snap it at the end. I kind of wish that there was an option to leave that turned on to where when you scaled it, it would snap it mathematically perfect. But recognize that then it would be making decisions on which keyframe your key is on for you. And sometimes that could mess some stuff up. So anyway, I have this now like this. And what I really wanted to talk about is this translate Y curve, right? Like what I'm looking at when I'm editing in the graph editor on this translate Y curve. So again, I think you all know this. Alt middle click, I can move around. Alt right click, I zoom in and out. Shift Alt right click, and I can zoom in one axis or another. So if I'm needing this motion to ease in, right, you'll see that it's completely flat. This is my translate Y. Completely flat, meaning it's not moving up at all. Then it eases in here, moves upward to the top point, goes completely flat again, right? Now, if I needed this to ease out more, I could just grab this keyframe and sort of ease it in like that, right? So we kind of know that that works, and the same here, ease it out like that, and sort of soften that motion now. And so now what we get is a little bit of ease out on each side, right? We also know that I can go in here and sort of break these tangents, and I can have something like this, right? Where it sort of pops up. Or I can undo that and break these tangents and have it sort of hit a wall. However, that's really up to this point probably the extent of what I've covered on the graph editor with you all. And that's not really the most of the things that I'm doing when I'm polishing the curves in a character animation. Like there's actually just a lot of little things you can do in here that subtly change that motion, right? So that's what I wanted to talk about today at the end of this, which is creating some additional information on this curve. So most of you probably already know about this because we did the graph editor arrow under keys, add key tool. This is a really handy tool. To me, it gets really boring or really annoying to go up there to that menu and do that every time I need it. I use it so much that I create a shortcut key for it. So I'll show you how to do that. We just go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor. Takes it a second to open. And then I go to Choose a Category, Editors, and Graph Editor. And then it's this Add Key tool right there. Now, the letter T is already assigned to something else in the graph editor, but it's something that I never really use. Right? I use it, I just don't use the shortcut key T for it. If there's another key that you use, like, I don't know, like N, or I don't know, like any of these that you think would be a better key for you, that's fine. I usually just wire it to T. Gives me a warning, it says that's already used for the center view, and that's where you can like center your viewport on wherever your mouse is, or wherever your timeline is, or time slider is. But I would rather use this for the add key tool. And so I hit save and close. And so now whenever I'm ready, I can start adding that key tool in just by hitting T. So you can tell the difference. When I'm in the move tool, it's the arrow. When I hit T, I get this little bullseye, right? So the way I'm going to do this, some of the things that I do is I select the curve, hit T, and then I use this to change the way this curve is flowing, okay? So an example that, or comparison that I thought was very good, I think David Edwards used this one. He said that, think of this as a roller coaster, right? Like this is not how you would build a roller coaster. If you were riding on this curve, it's like perfectly flat, going really, really flat, and then suddenly you're shooting up this hill, like that's going to be really uncomfortable, right? So that's the same thing. Like this is just like this conservation of energy, right? And so what would make this easier to transition up that hill, the same way like how you turn into a parking spot, you kind of swing wide before turning in, is maybe I put a little bit of anticipation at the beginning of this. Right? So I select this curve, middle click, and I can add like a little anticipation at the beginning of this and like another key there to kind of lead into this, right? Now the same thing with like hitting this top point. Maybe I want to ease into that a lot. I could do that with a tangent, but I could also add another keyframe here and ease in a whole lot, right? So move this out more and kind of let it ease in like slower, right? So again, with this add key tool, I'm able to quickly make some pretty significant changes to this, right? For example, if I wanted to overshoot here, right? T, click here, add some overshoot to it, and it'll come back, right? And then I can just pretty quickly adjust that to get something that feels a little more natural. I was already working at Firaxis before somebody showed me this as a way of working, and it changed my life. Like I know that sounds crazy, but really what I just showed you is you can draw your curve in the graphic, right? This was one of those, like, I remember the day. I remember it so much because of the way it changed the way I work. Yeah. Because it's also stuff like now I have complete control of how I ease in and out between these two curves, right? Like, if I wanted to ease into this, that's just one more key that I have to add, right? I click a key right here, and if I pull it down, I'm easing in, and if I pull it up, well, I guess if I pull it down, I'm easing out of that first keyframe, and if I pull it up, I'm easing in, right? And so I can control that motion, right? I can control my spacing with more keyframes. And the really cool thing about this, and what we'll look at later in Project 2, is that I can make this do whatever I want to, right? I can literally make my bouncing ball happen very quickly with this. Right? And the amount of like change I can make quickly is just, it's ridiculous. I encourage you to use this just because it's something that works really well for me. And like, is really, it really takes some of that like mystery out of the graph editor when I'm just like, I don't care what the tangent is doing. I'm just going to add more keyframes. Not everybody works the same, but I would say give it a try and see if it helps. Just wiring it to T, middle click allows you to add the new key to it, right? You have to have the curve selected in some way first. So you would just select one of the keys, hit T, middle click, and I can literally draw whatever curve I want on this motion. Now, if you go back and watch some of those videos that we just walked through, especially the hip splining one, that's the feet, that's the wrong one. You'll see me doing this all over the place. Like I am constantly like adding new keys, moving keys. You'll see it starts probably right about here. There we go, added a new key, and I just sort of created that extra part of that curve to get some overshoot. All right, questions? Comments? All right.
So what was key to insert key?
I had to create that one, but I used key to add key tool. But it's, so,
Wasn't there some button you pull down and click on the curve to insert key?
yeah, but by default there's not. By default you have to go to keys, add key tool. But the shortcut key I attached to it was T. And so I just did that with Windows, settings and preferences, hotkey editor. And then you can assign whatever you want to. Like if some of you would prefer like F2 or something like that. Like if you have a preference of the way you work. There's also, I know, just talking with a former student, he recently bought like an extra it's like a gaming keyboard peripheral thing that is like an extra set of keys that you can program your own keys into. And it's like just having some extra keys on your keyboard basically. And some people attach it to stuff like that. The only thing you have to be careful is you don't want to attach it to W, because W is the move tool no matter which editor you're in. And you don't want to attach it to S. There's a lot of keyframes or a lot of shortcut keys that you just use a lot, and you don't want to accidentally overwrite those and have to reset it. So.
Right, so it tells you what's assigned or not, so you don't double assign.
Yeah, this is really nice. And this is something if you have some other tool you use a lot. I used to have a shortcut key for Play Blast, where I just hit the P button and it'll Play Blast it. And I don't know why I don't really set that up anymore. I probably should. It's probably because I renamed my Play Blasts a lot so I can document it. I really like being able to go back and look at where I was at the beginning of the day and where I am at the end of the day and see that progress. It's a little bit of an accomplishment then. Other questions, comments, ideas? All right. I don't necessarily know if the last part of this needs a lecture, but I'm going to record it anyway, the last part of the video, or the last part of my shot. I'm going to record it anyway, and I'm going to be aiming at next class period to be completely done myself. That way I can show you how I'm offsetting the arms. I feel like I kind of explained it verbally anyway, so you probably don't necessarily have to have that, but I still want to give it to you, even if it's just even if you pick up a small little tidbit of advice from it, it'll be worth it, right? And I think it'll also be a nice, it'll be a nice way to archive this. I'm recording these videos of these lectures, and really by the time we're done with that lecture, I have gone over the entire character animation process. That sounds far-reaching, but I do think that you'll get halfway through this semester when we're on the pantomime shot. Just pop those up in another screen and listen to them while you're working, and you will start to see more things in hindsight, right? You'll start to be like, oh, I get what he's talking about because I ran into that thing at the end of my shot too, right? And it may have not made as much sense the first time you heard it. The second, the third time you heard it, you may actually get something from it. So I want to archive the entire thing on YouTube so you have that process to watch through later. And frankly, just because then I can pass it off to somebody who didn't take the class and say, oh, here, watch this if you're wanting some more information on it, right? Other questions, comments? All right, well, that's most of what I have for today, so I'm going to turn the rest of the class over to you all after one more announcement, but I want to go ahead and stop the video first because it's not pertinent to the video. Bye.